Good morning and welcome to the annual State of the Economy. I'm Dan Heiser, Dean of the Donald J. Schneider School of Business and Economics at St. Norbert College. Two quick housekeeping items before we start. Excuse me. A little technical difficulty there. Sorry about that. Two quick housekeeping items before we start. First, we have a full hour planned. As a result, we will not be fielding questions during the webinar. I ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to capture your questions. Our panelists will then respond after the presentation by email. Second, one of the most frequently asked questions we receive is for a copy of today's presentation. I'll answer that one now. Yes, you will be able to request a copy of the presentation through our post-event survey, so important you respond. Now back to the business at hand. St. Norbert College has presented the State of Economy for 8 years. From humble beginnings, each year the event grows. Today, there are hundreds in attendance representing over 70 organizations. This event continues to flourish because it is truly a community event. Your feedback is taken seriously and helps us craft the next iteration. For example, based on your previous comments, today we feature a deep dive into the state of an industry important to the region, hospitality. The State of the Economy is brought to you by the Center of Business and Economic Analysis at St. Norbert College. The CBEA was launched over 6 years ago. It was founded as a vehicle to bring real-world analysis into higher ed and provide our students with a hands-on research opportunity. Presentations like today's build a strong talent pipeline between the college and the regional community as students transition from academia to professional careers. A guiding principle of St. Norbert College is the spirit of communio. This Norbertine concept of communio embraces the practice of a community coming together in service of one another. The CBA embodies this spirit by working in collaboration with leaders in the local business and nonprofit community to address meaningful and impactful questions. Today, we are pleased to have an esteemed group of presenters. Marc Schaffer, Associate Professor of Economics, Director of the CBEA and holder of the endowed Michaels Chair. Two of the CBEA's outstanding student researchers, Emily O'Leary and Peyton Jack. And finally, our special guest, Christine Luce, Vice President of Lodging and Wellness at Kohler Co. Not only is Christine able to provide unique insights into the hospitality industry, she is also an SNC alum and an active trustee of the college. We're particularly grateful for her participation. I want to thank Christine, Marc, Emily, and Peyton for sharing their analysis today. So without further ado, I pass the baton to Marc to begin this year's State of the Economy. Marc?
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate the warm introduction. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to have you participate in the conversation. So as Dan said, we've been doing this for a number of years now. Obviously, we're transitioning to a bit of a virtual environment this year to mix it up a little bit. In terms of today, really excited for the topic of conversation. We're going to start off by talking about sort of the national state of the economy. That's going to be the focal point of our conversation from the CBA perspective. If you were able to join us for our December event, we actually did more of a state and regional take. So this is going to be focused heavily on the national side with a little bit of Wisconsin mixed in. And after our presentation at the national level, we're going to slide into a really exciting presentation about what's going on in the hospitality industry. I got a preview of this from Christine the other day, and it's a really good talk, very informative, good conversation. So that being said, what I want to do is sort of kick off our part of the conversation today, what we're going to focus on. So we're going to give you a bit of a high-level take of what's happening in the GDP space, talk a little bit about what's happening in labor markets, talk about some markets that are actually thriving a little bit in our unique economic environment, and then we'll jump into some policy conversation and talk about some of the challenges moving forward ahead. Now, for those of you that were able to join us for our presentation last year, it was a little bit different than what we're going to talk about this year. Last year, we basically gave this in the beginning of February. The COVID conversation was just becoming something where we were talking about here in the US. And we very much had a lot of strong economic growth happening at the beginning of 2020. Of course, it's been an interesting adjustment over the past year with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to talk through a little bit about how that has sort of spilled over into some of the economic effects. So as Dan said, I'm joined by two of my excellent students, Peyton Jack, Emily O'Leary, both seniors Been working with them for a number of years. Excellent students. Unfortunately, both either have a job or are in a grad program for a PhD in economics. So they're already taken off the job market. My apologies for those employers looking for some star students. But I'm going to pass it over to Peyton and Emily to get started on our beginning section here, talking about GDP.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. He has also been a great mentor to me and Emily, so I really owe him a lot. But first, let's talk a little bit about some big picture GDP stuff. This year was kind of crazy, as we all know. It was the end of the longest period of economic expansion in U.S. history. And before those crazy numbers in quarter 2 and quarter 3, the U.S. economy grew for 128 consecutive months, which is something that's noteworthy. And then, normally in a good year, we can show you this graphic on the next slide. It's sort of nice and clean. We're sort of in that 2 to 3% growth range. This is actually pulled right from last year's presentation. And we have each component highlighted in a different color. And we can usually clearly see what's going on with each component. But moving along to this year's graph, we can clearly see that it's just not the case. The sheer magnitude of the shifts really limits the impact graphics like this the message they can convey. And we see those dramatic shifts, and it's really consumption and investment behavior that's driving a lot of that. But if we move to a more simplified version, we can see exactly what's going on. So quarter 1, U.S. economy contracted 5%, down 31% in quarter 2, a nice swing in quarter 3 at 33%, and then relatively more modest gains in quarter 4. But in a normal year, 4% growth would be great. But if we move along here, like I said earlier, it's not really surprising that consumption and investment behavior drove a lot of these shifts that we've seen. So business investment is highlighted in that light gray, and consumption spending is highlighted in that green. And we can clearly see that they account for essentially the majority of the shifts we're seeing. So as we move along, we're going to talk a little bit about consumption, do a little bit of a deep dive into consumption. Some really interesting dynamics are going on here. And like I said, consumption behavior really drove much of what we saw in terms of GDP shifts. In a normal year, it always accounts for about 2/3 of GDP growth. And we can see that in quarter 2, it really fell off a cliff, down 24%, just consumption spending. Quarter 3, a nice recovery, 25%. And then again, more modest gains in quarter 4 at 1.7%. So we're going to do a little deep dive into the components of consumption spending. So consumption spending is one of the components of GDP, but there are also components to consumption, which is what we're looking at here. So we have services in gray, service spending in gray, non-durable goods spending in yellow, and then durable goods in green. And we can see that right off the bat, it was the service portion of consumption spending that really took a hit. And that's not all that surprising, given lockdowns, people staying at home, people not traveling, all of that. And we see that, if you want to know what happened with consumption, you should look at what happened with service spending. Non-durable goods and durable goods remained relatively stable throughout the year. But we can see service spending down almost 22% in quarter 1. Again, a nice gain, almost 16% in service spending down 22% in quarter 2, and then nice gain in quarter 3, and then more marginal gains in quarter 4. And on the next slide, we really see the story behind this. It's not surprising that with high levels of uncertainty, people aren't really spending that much money. So on this graphic, we can see different peaks of uncertainty. We have the Great Recession, the last economic crisis in 2009, general election in 2016, some Brexit trade war stuff in 2019, and then this year. If you look at this year compared to the financial crisis, it makes it seem like a drop in the bucket, which of course it wasn't, but everything is relative to consumers. And of course, when there's high levels of uncertainty, the next graph shows exactly what consumers will do. They save, and they save a lot. At the peak of this year's saving, consumers were saving about 1/3 of every dollar of income. That's pretty staggering, and undoubtedly it was helped by relief payments. People pocketed a lot of that money, and it came down relatively quickly. But if you look at that graph, we still are operating in an environment where consumers are saving 13, 14 cents on every dollar. which is much higher than sort of your standard baseline savings rate. And that's going to continue to squeeze the consumption component as we move along. And the next graph, excuse me, it kind of shows what consumers are thinking, right? Consumer sentiment fell off a cliff in 2020, in March and April. People didn't know what was going on. It mirrors that uncertainty. But there are some signs for optimism. We can see sentiment is sort of trending back upwards with those bumps. And it's something to keep in mind as we move into 2021 to see if that trend continues upward. It's going to take a while for consumer sentiment to fully recover, but hopefully we'll get there sooner rather than later. And then moving along, we're going to talk a little bit about the next biggest component in GDP, that would be business investment spending. And investment is highlighted in that light gray for you folks. And if you remember, consumption spending was down 24% in Q2. Well, the next biggest component also played a huge role in those shifts we saw in GDP. So business investment spending down almost 9% in Q2, nice swing in Q3, up 12%, and then a very strong Q4, up 4.1%. And if we look at the actual components of business investment spending, so just like consumption spending has components, so does business investment spending. We see the inventories highlighted in that gray there. Much of this behavior this year can be explained by what we saw happening with private inventories. So if we think back to the end of last year, Q4, holiday shopping season, inventories are drawn down. Q1 of the following year is usually a time when businesses have a little breathing room, they can build back up inventories. So we saw inventory builds in Q1, and then in Q2, all the craziness hit. People started buying everything in sight, and then buying everything from the warehouse. And pretty soon they're camping outside the store, waiting for a truck to show up. And businesses never got a chance to rebuild inventories in Q2, which is part of the reason we see such a dramatic drop in Q2. And in Q3, people realized, geez, the supply chain hasn't broken down. I can get the things I need to get. And that was the breathing room businesses need to really rebuild inventories because they've been depleted for the last 3 quarters. Now, residential fixed investment, the housing market was hot. We all know that. And Emily is going to talk about that in a little bit. But if you really want the story with business investment spending, it was really private inventory behavior that drove much of the shifts, most of the shifts we've seen. And with that, I'm going to pass you along to my colleague, fellow student Emily, who's going to take us through the next 2 components of GDP and then touch on some market dynamics. So Emily, it is all yours.
Thank you, Peyton. So as he mentioned, we're now going to look at the government spending component of GDP. So the government deficit tripled in the fiscal year of 2020, becoming the largest deficit to date. And that actually amounts to about 15% of GDP, which is the greatest deficit as a share of the economy since 1945. And so one thing to note is that government transfer payments are not counted in the government portion of GDP, but are instead captured in the consumption and investment sections that Peyton was talking about when they are spent. So this explains why the government spending portion appears so small because it was already captured. So then moving on to net exports. So global uncertainty and lockdowns led to serious disruptions in international trade. Many borders were closed, which meant trade became restricted. And countries were also experiencing their peaks in COVID at different times, meaning that while some countries could relax their measures, others were forced to close. So then we are going to look at the trade-weighted US dollar index on this slide. And you can actually see the dollar was strong at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And this is because investors flocked to the dollar as a safe investment during times of panic and uncertainty. So then as more countries have been stabilizing and getting vaccinations, the relative advantage for the US has faded, which helps to explain some of the fall. So now we are going to recap the different components of GDP. So we will start with consumption. So consumers have set a record as far as saving, as Peyton mentioned. and the consumption of durable and non-durable goods remained steady, while the service sector faced incredible volatility throughout the year. So then with investments, inventory is to blame for much of the volatility, while residential construction helped in the recovery in quarters 3 and 4. So then with government spending, we saw the highest deficit in history by tripling in the fiscal year of 2020. And as I mentioned previously, watch out for transfer payments that were included in other components of GDP. So then with net exports, the uncertainty and disruption in global trade caused net exports to fall, while the declining US dollar index should boost net exports going forward. Okay, so now we are going to look at how the labor market was affected over 2020. So first, we are going to look at initial claims. So right before the pandemic on March 7th, initial claims were at 211,000. So then when we look at our peak on March 28th, which is to the way right side of the screen, we are looking at nearly 7 million claims, which is a 3,150% increase. So as with a lot of the data in the presentation, that number has dropped back down, but we're still sitting at approximately 850,000 claims as of early February. And that is still 3 to 4 times what we are normally at for initial claims. So on the next slide, we are going to look at the unemployment rate, which we all know unemployment skyrocketed in the spring, peaking in April at 14.8% due to businesses shutting down and workers and customers staying home to avoid the virus. So prior to this, the unemployment rate was at 3.5% before shooting up in April. And then while it is trending downward again, we are still well above pre-pandemic levels at about 6% in January. So then on our next slide, we are going to look at job openings versus the unemployment level. So throughout 2019, there were more job openings than there were workers, meaning businesses were having trouble finding people to fill available roles. So during the pandemic, this trend reversed, so that there are now a lot of people out of work and fewer openings. And you can see that gap is starting to close again, but there's still a ways to go there. So now we are going to change gears a little bit and look at markets that didn't follow the trend of 2020 and look at markets that actually thrived during the pandemic. So first, we are looking at the housing market. So the median listing price, which is in green, has steadily grown over 2020. And the yellow line is the median days on the market, which you can see moves in the opposite direction. So these both indicate that the housing market is doing well, which is partially due to low mortgage rates and declining inventory. So on our next slide, we look at housing starts. And so you can see a sharp decline in housing starts at the beginning of 2020. And so not only though have they recovered, but actually they totaled 1.38 million in 2020, which is actually up 7% from 2019. So then another market that defied expectations was the stock market. So while the stock market crashed from late February into early April, it still had a better year than forecasted. And then, of course, on the next slide, but it pales in comparison to how GameStop performed. So on that note, I will turn it over to Marc.
Emily, Peyton, thank you very much for that nice overview of what's happening in the GDP space, labor markets, and thriving markets. So what I'm going to do in my section here is pick up where they left off. I want to talk a little bit about the policy response we've seen as it pertains to what the Federal Reserve has done, as well as what the government has done to respond to what's happened from an economic standpoint. Of course, there's the health conversation. We're going to focus on the economic side here. So talk a little about policy and then sort of end with a conversation on some of the challenges ahead that we're seeing as a result of how we're responding to this pandemic. So first, I'm gonna jump into monetary policy. Now, monetary policy, there's a lot in this slide, and part of that, frankly, is so when you guys look at the deck later, it makes some sense. But if I were to think about how the Federal Reserve has actually responded to this crisis, I would kind of sort of section off in 3 components. The first component is they did their conventional policy tools. They did what they always do when we have some sort of economic event happen that they need to react to, we start to fall into recession, they do things like drop the federal funds rate. So they drop the interest rate. In this case, they actually lowered some other rates to assist largely the banking industry. And then they also pursued a policy of forward guidance, which I'll talk about in a second. So here's what we see initially. This is standard Federal Reserve response to what happens in a crisis. What you see is we saw, the rates fall obviously in the financial crisis. They were near zero, 2008, 9, all the way through to about 2016, 2017, 2018. Rates started to rise as the economy strengthened. And then of course, COVID hits and we start to have the economic challenges and we see them drop rates back to zero again. Now, so much so that they actually have an expectation, and this is the forward guidance piece, they have an expectation of keeping rates low for the foreseeable future. So what you're looking at in this figure is actually what's called the Federal Reserve dot plot. This is actually how the members on the FOMC that are deciding interest rates, this is what they think interest rates are going to be at over the foreseeable future of the next couple of years. So basically, the forward guidance piece of the Federal Reserve is they've come out and said, look, the economy has had some challenges here. We're here to support this as long as we need to get us through this crisis. So that's the first thing that we see in terms of the Federal Reserve response. The second thing they did is they essentially dusted off the playbook from the financial crisis. So in the financial crisis period, they created a bunch of new policy tools. And if I was going to summarize what all of these are doing, I would basically say two things. One, all of these policies are designed to basically help the financial industry and the banking industry. In the financial crisis, they needed a lot of help. In this current environment, one of the things the Fed, I think, targeted early on was, we know there's a broad economic crisis. We don't want to compound this by adding on a financial crisis as well. So all of these tools here that I have highlighted are really designed to help financial markets, to make sure they stay liquid, to make sure we avoid some kind of financial crisis on top of it. One of the notable things there that they did in the financial crisis, and they did again in this crisis, is they did a lot of asset purchasing. A lot of this was targeting different types of products to create liquidity in the financial system. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a second. Now, the new part, though, that they added in the current crisis in terms of the response, and this would be the third part of what I would say they've done, is they added new policy tools that were really designed to help, we might say Main Street as opposed to Wall Street, if you're using that terminology. And these tools were literally designed to help non-financial firms, first of all. So even some of the PPP stuff, if you're familiar with that, the Paycheck Protection Program, some of those programs were actually helped supported and funded by some of the Federal Reserve programming. The other area that they added that was new as well is they actually created some municipal liquidity facilities and funding. This was basically designed to help state and local government that needed access to resources. So in short, what was the Federal Reserve response? They basically did their conventional tools, dropping interest rates to support the economy. They had a bunch of tools designed to help the financial system, make sure we don't have a financial crisis on top of it. And third, they created a bunch of tools to help Main Street and more non-financial firms weather the storm of this crisis. So what are some of the ramifications of that? Well, the first thing, as I mentioned, is they bought up a lot of securities to help create liquidity to the marketplace. So one of the immediate things you see is the Federal Reserve, basically their balance sheet and the section that holds security outright jumped from about 3.9 trillion prior to COVID to about 6.9 trillion. So they basically bought up about $3 trillion worth of assets that was designed to help provide liquidity to the marketplace. So that's a significant change we've seen from the Federal Reserve. One of the consequences of that is we've seen a huge explosion in real money supply. So this is how much money is effectively out in the economy. That would be one of the big concerns people are talking about, is the Federal Reserve just spent a lot of time and money to support the economy, which we see in this graph. And the big concern is, well, is this going to lead to an inflation problem? And the answer to that as of right now is, if it is, it's not showing up yet. So here you're looking at consumer price index. This is the percentage change in the price level. So this is a measure of inflation effectively. And what we can see, these are two different measures that we can look at. One sort of total CPI, the other is if you take out food and energy, which is another way you can look at it, sometimes called core CPI. What we see here is, even with all of this money that's been pumped into the economy, we have not yet to see that widespread inflation. Now, again, we may have seen it in individual markets like supply and demand markets. I know there was a bump in like meat for a while. Lumber prices might be high. Those are individual market price movements. Here we're talking about broad-based inflation. We're not seeing that heavy inflation hitting yet, but it will be something that the Federal Reserve is going to monitor closely. A recent statement from the Fed basically said they're going to support the economy as long as they need to, keeping in line with making sure inflation doesn't start to take off. Jerome Powell actually came out and indicated that that's kind of their playbook right now. That's their plan. So the Fed has done a ton to support the economy. What has the government done? And of course, this is a topic of conversation that's pretty much in the news on a regular basis at the moment. I'm going to focus on, there's a lot of things we could talk about here. I'm going to focus on sort of the major fiscal policy legislative acts that they've passed. And to date, they've passed 4. There actually is one being discussed right now in DC. I was reading that I think there might be some vote happening on that later next week to see if that stimulus package goes through. But essentially, here's sort of the 4 acts that they've already passed. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act, that was very, very early on. The big act that most of us probably heard about in the news was the CARES Act. That was the one that hit kind of March, April with the first round of the stimulus checks that went out to individuals. And then they had a follow-up to the CARES Act, the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. This was a smaller act that was basically designed to help the PPP program after the CARES Act because they realized they needed more funding. And then the more recent one was the Response and Relief Act that was passed basically in December, kind of rolling into January there as well. So, of course, the big question is, well, what's the impact of all of this? Like, there's been a lot of spending happening. What ultimately is the effect that this is having in terms of specifically, as Emily had mentioned, the government deficit and ultimately the government debt? So what you're looking at here is a table of sort of the spending by these acts that were passed and kind of broken out by different categories of where the funds went. So kind of looking at small business support, unemployment benefits, recovery rebates, healthcare spending, state and local aid, tax relief, and other spending in there as well. Now, what I'm showing you is numbers that are estimated to be the net cost of these programs. So some of these packages were actually a little bit larger, but some of those might have lending components where money might actually be coming back to the program. So what you're actually looking at here is sort of what we think the actual impact is on the budget in terms of the actual cost, how it's going to hit the deficit, basically. And what you see if you look along the bottom row there is the total COVID relief. The Families First one I said was real small in relative size. It didn't get a lot of attention necessarily, but the big one was the CARES Act. We see that was about $1.9 trillion in terms of an estimated net cost. The follow-up was that one that kind of support PPP heavily, where you see a lot of money going to small businesses with that $255 billion there. And then we see rolling into the Response and Relief Act was kind of the most recent one that was passed. That was about the $900 billion one that just came through. So if you kind of put all of this together, the first thing to note is the federal government has kind of put out about $3.4 trillion in aid, relief, small business support across the board. So this is essentially the hit we're talking about from a deficit standpoint, ultimately a debt standpoint for the federal government. Now, it's worth noting, and I'm going to take that last column there, percent of total, just to sort of highlight specifically where all of this funding went. The biggest portion of the funding, actually 27%, just shy of a third of the funding actually was geared towards helping small businesses who undoubtedly felt a challenge in this time frame. The next area was unemployment benefits. As Emily mentioned, we had this huge run up in initial claims that happened obviously very, very fast. And a lot of the state systems were not prepared to handle the amount of unemployment claims they were getting, and extra funding was needed for support. So we see unemployment benefits about 17%. And then the recovery rebates, those are the stimulus check components at about 13%, and you see down the line. But I think that the biggest thing you realize is if you're gonna put where's most of this money gone, I would say it's gone to help small business initially, the unemployment piece, and then finally the recovery rebates are going to make up the bulk of what we're looking at. Okay. Now, what, of course, is the impact of all of this on the government deficit as well as the government debt? As Emily mentioned when she talked about government spending, she noted that the deficit effectively tripled. And to give you sort of a snapshot of what this looks like, went and pulled the data for the federal government from fiscal year 2019 and compared it to fiscal year 2020. So here we're looking at revenue to the government. This is basically all coming in form of taxes on the top. And then we're looking at spending by the government, which is effectively all the money going out from the government coffers, if you will. Now, a couple things to note when you look at this. First, the government fiscal year essentially runs from October 1st to September 30th. So the fiscal year 2020 data you're looking at doesn't include the additional stimulus act that was passed in December, January. So this is only counting through what happened up to end of September 2020. And the big thing you realize is a lot of the spending categories, as well as the revenue categories, a lot of them remain somewhat flat, not a lot of significant change, except for on the bottom there, the category called other spending. This is the category that basically you see this massive, about $3 trillion hit come, and that effectively was all of the COVID legislative acts that were designed to assist through the economic crisis. But when we say the government deficit tripled, we're looking at those bottom numbers in red there. In fiscal year 2019, we ran about a $1 trillion deficit. So the economy was strong. We're in the $1 trillion deficit in the good economy. And then we had to step in to support the economy as a result of the pandemic. So we see pushing for the fiscal year 2020 about a $3.1 trillion deficit just in that single year. Now, of course, that begs the question, if we ran a $3.1 trillion deficit in a single year, what does that look like in terms of debt? And looking at the debt side, I'm showing you two different measures of debt here. You'll hear both of them reported, which is why I like to show them. The first line, the green line, is total public debt. So this includes debt that we effectively owe ourselves. So you can think about, if the Social Security program is holding some money in treasury bonds, for example, it might be deemed debt we owe ourselves. So that would be counted in the green line. The yellow line excludes debt we owe ourselves. So that's sort of the difference between the two lines. And depending on how you measure it, we're pushing at, if we exclude the debt we owe ourselves with the yellow line, we're pushing about 100% debt to GDP ratio right now. And if you look at the green line, we're pushing higher, probably about 130%, high 120% rates in terms of how much debt we have relative to the size of our economy in terms of GDP. Now, there's a much longer conversation we could have to unpack what's going on here, which we frankly don't have time for right now. I think in the short run, the concerns of the debt, there's reasons to be concerned about the debt. However, I think in the short run, the focal point needs to be on getting through the economic crisis that we have. Long-term conversation about the impact of this, there's a lot of debate about that. But I think the one thing I will say that gives me comfort about the situation is as long as we are as the United States, we're a reserve currency for the world. Our U.S. Treasury is seen as the gold standard. As long as those two conditions hold, we're okay from a debt standpoint. If anything happens, and maybe there's a debt number where this happens, where those two assumptions get questioned, we could have some problems. But in the short run, I think we're very okay. And the focal point on getting through the crisis, getting us back to decent economic standing, needs to be the emphasis of our policies right now. And again, we could definitely have a much longer conversation about that because there's a lot of nuance in that conversation. So I wanted to give you a brief idea of what's been happening from a policy standpoint. And now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the challenges ahead. What are some things that we could be thinking of? And I think for me, there's kind of three areas I want to talk about here. The first is diverging industries and how the recovery has been across industries. The second is accelerating socioeconomic disparities. And the third is briefly a comment about the future of the pandemic. Now, I think my overarching takeaway point from the challenges ahead is I think we all have to take a step back and acknowledge that this crisis from an economic standpoint, there's a health conversation here, of course, but from an economic standpoint, this is leaving a lot of people in varying circumstances depending on what their situation is. And that could be different industries have been impacted in different ways, different households have been impacted in different ways. And in many ways, the path to recovery here is very much, it's fractured. Some people have been able to weather this storm without too much trouble from an economic standpoint. Other people have had a much harder time. And a lot of it depends on many specific factors, which I want to talk about. So first, let's talk about diverging industries. So the first thing to acknowledge is different industries have been affected differently in this crisis. So I'm going to show you three graphs here in a row. I'm going to talk about industries that seem like they've recovered. And the graphs you're looking at here essentially highlight and track spending data. So credit card and debit card spending. So where are consumers spending their money? And I'm basically showing you a series of lines here. And the industries that in many ways we might deem, say, recovered. So what you're looking at is starting in January of 2020. This is what our baseline is. And this entire graph looks at how this has changed relative to the beginning of the year. And you notice, once COVID starts to hit, once we start to have some lockdowns and some concerns, what we quickly see is that we suddenly started to run to the grocery store and spend money, right? You want to stock up some money, some resources, get your toilet paper, and you see a huge run up in spending at grocery stores that came back down. But then a lot of that spending has remained actually above what we were doing in January. Retail, same thing. Retail had an initial fall off, but once people sort of normalized and figured out what their COVID situation was in their household, you saw retail spending kind of start to pick up a little bit. And some of that could be sort of the substitution effect away from other industries where they were previously spending some money. Some industries that are kind of in the recovering stages, we could put general merchandise and healthcare in those spaces. They definitely fell off when the initial onset of COVID hit the United States. But in many ways, they've kind of largely recovered and got back to and recovering back to where they were about a year ago in January 2020. Healthcare has been a particularly interesting space. That was one of the areas, as Peyton mentioned, that services had an interesting industry behavior over the past year. You would think in a pandemic, we need healthcare, which we obviously do. But one of the things we saw from a spending perspective is that a lot of people, unless they had to go to the hospital, they were trying to avoid some elective procedures and avoid going to hospitals and healthcare unless they had to, especially early on with COVID. So that was a sector that actually felt some interesting growing pains, if you will, throughout the year. But a lot of that has started to get back to some level of normalcy. Then we can slide to industries that are definitely still lagging. And these are industries that we would expect would change our behavior in light of a pandemic. So looking at sectors in terms of consumer spending on restaurants and hotels, transportation. Transportation's interesting. So here, think about consumer spending on transportation. So you're not buying airline tickets and stuff like that. There are sectors of transportation that have actually done reasonably well. But here, think about consumer spending, which is what we're tracking here. And lastly, entertainment and recreation. Now, one of the reasons why I'm excited about our talk today is actually we're going to be joined by Christine Luce from Kohler to talk a little about some of that hospitality situation, which is one of those industries that has had a very interesting year in terms of how they've had to cope with, deal with, and respond to this interesting circumstance of consumers maybe shying away from these industries because of the pandemic. Now, while we see that industries have had varying experiences, the same thing holds actually at the household level. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And if you joined our presentation in December, this is the same information because I think it's really important. But there really is an interesting labor market divide that's happened. And one of the ways we can break that out is those who have the ability to work remotely and those who cannot. A lot of people who work in jobs that could easily switch to being remote workers, work from home. A lot of those workers were able to sort of keep their jobs, slide into just a different type of working environment, but not see a huge necessary disruption in how much household income they brought in. All right, so here you're looking at Wisconsin actually falls right about the US average, about 36-37% had the ability to slide into remote work. This is from a US Census Bureau household pulse survey. And the interesting about that is when you start to dig a little bit deeper into the data, what you find is some of that ability to work from home actually aligns with income. So what you're looking at is survey responses, and you're breaking out those responses by work from home or not. So green says, yes, I could work from home, or I could substitute to work from home for telework. Yellow says they could not. And what you notice there is over sort of a threshold of about 75,000, you had more people with the ability to actually remote work, which is a little bit different from the people who make less than 75,000 as a household that didn't have that ability. So you're starting to see this fractured part of the recovery that some sectors may have felt this more than others. We can also look at the education perspective. The same question in terms of telework seems to align heavily with higher levels of education. Those with bachelor's degrees had jobs that made it they were more easily able to switch to work from home as opposed to those who did not. This is sort of spilling over into recovery based on your income level. So high income unemployment has largely recovered from what happened as a result of the pandemic, where you see low income employment actually has fallen off a little bit. So this is definitely a challenge moving forward. To add to that, there's a bit of a challenge in terms of school closures. And what we see in terms of the labor force is that disproportionately, we see families that have children obviously have had to react to school closures differently than individuals or families that don't have children. And here's a great article from the New York Times that sort of did a comparison. You're looking at school closures across the bottom axis, and you're looking at labor force participation change along the vertical axis. The left graph is looking at what's happened for men effectively, and the right graph is what's happened to women. And the big takeaway from this essentially is that on the whole, it seems as a result of this pandemic, women have largely stepped up to better take care of the household in this context. Take care of the kids if schools are closing. Women are tending to bear more of the burden of this, which could also be an unfortunate side effect of gender pay gap issues as well. But this is definitely something that we're watching that needs to be tracked moving forward, because this is a huge concern in the labor market, that you have a particular group in the labor market that is disproportionately being affected by this. So it's definitely something I think a lot of people are paying attention to. So what's the future of the pandemic look like? Yeah, I don't know. I can't tell you. I'm not the epidemiologist here. I'm the economist. But I will say it looks like there's some more optimism coming in some of our economic data, which is good. We're seeing the vaccine rollout be a positive development here moving forward, which is good. I think the one thing that I'm thinking about and I'm looking at, this is a graph I've been watching. This is a graph that looks at mobility engagement. So this is essentially tracking people moving outside of their home. So what you really see here is when the pandemic essentially started to roll out, we see a lot of people stayed from home across all different states. This happened. What we see is that largely came back, but you still see people staying away from restaurants, staying away from hospitality, not going back to their behavior prior to the pandemic. And this, I think, is really going to be our challenge, is what's it going to take to get us to start to return to some level of normalcy. And I think this is where it's going to queue up nicely, where I'm going to pass it over to Christine, and she can talk a little bit about the role that all of this is having on the hospitality industry. So I'm going to slide off my share here. I'll pass it over to Christine to take over. Excited to hear what she has to say.
Good morning. Just one moment here as I get my presentation up. Well, it really is an honor to be here as a very proud alumni and trustee. Anytime I can engage with the St. Norbert community is truly an honor. I wanted to start today by talking a little bit about who is Kohler Hospitality. Many of you are probably aware of our plumbing products for kitchen and bath, but many of you may not realize we actually have 3 hospitality locations. In Kohler, Wisconsin, we have both the American Club in Otwood Lake and of course our 4 championship golf courses and Kohler Water Spa. We also have a destination located in St. Andrews, Scotland, the Old Course Hotel located on the iconic Old Course Golf Course, the birth of golf. And finally, for those of you located up in Green Bay, you're probably familiar with our newest property, Lodge Kohler, which is in partnership with the Green Bay Packers on the Titletown Plaza. And we do also have 2 Chicago spas in Burr Ridge and Lincoln Park. So we have a presence in the state of Illinois as well. So to begin today, I'm going to read you the headline. 2020 is officially the worst year on record for hospitality. And what does that for U.S. hotels? And what does that exactly mean? Well, the first thing it means is that our occupancy declined 33% to a level of 44%. So of all the hotel rooms in the US, only 44% of them were rented throughout 2020. What we're actually collecting in rate dropped 21%. Average daily rate, which we refer to as ADR, dropped to $103.25, down 21%, as I mentioned. And finally, there's a metric we measure called revenue per available room, RevPAR. It's in essence a mathematical formula of the revenue we collect against all of our rooms. That fell 47% to $45.48, leaving us with 1 billion unsold room nights, which eclipsed the 786 million that were unsold during the Great Recession of 2009. And when you look at the industry in the US as an aggregate, the industry is expected to show nearly 0 profit for 2020. So that is why it's defined as the worst year on record for US hotels. And I'm sure that many of you are not surprised. About 6 in 10 travelers globally planned a trip that was canceled then in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But that doesn't also include trips where you might have planned them in the year for the year. So the number is even greater when you consider the trips that didn't happen, that would have happened in the year for the year. But in addition, how people plan trips also changed dramatically. The booking window, which we use to forecast, schedule, staff, shrunk to less than 21 days. So as an industry, not only were we dealing with lowering demand, but the demand we are receiving was coming in less than 3 weeks from the date of booking to the date of arrival, causing us as an industry to reinvent how we plan, staff, and schedule, because we lost that cushion or that more 60 to 90 day booking window that we enjoyed prior to that pandemic. So how did all of this impact Kohler Hospitality? So a few things I want to share to you today about the direct impact on us are the corporate group market basically disappeared overnight. Groups canceled. It was every day our team was picking up the phone for a group that was, well, in most cases, rescheduling and in some cases canceling. But regardless, they were not having their business in 2020. Up at Lodge Kohler, as you all know very well, the regular season football season from training camp to the final game in December was played without any fans. So that had a direct impact on Lodge Kohler and the other properties in the Green Bay market. Our property in St. Andrews, Scotland, the country of Scotland had a 2-week mandatory international traveler quarantine. So that decimated the luxury golf market, because who is going to want to take a trip to golf and have to spend 2 weeks quarantining before they're allowed to actually go and enjoy their vacation? And here in the United States, as we're all very well aware, following the different mandates, in Wisconsin, the orders were repealed, but we remained vigilant and we followed all CDC's and the state of Wisconsin recommendations. In the state of Illinois, we faced 2 spa closures. That industry was asked to close twice, and we actually have 1 spa still closed, about to open March 5th. And in Scotland, very, very aggressive restrictions over there. They've had 2 countrywide lockdowns where residents right now are only, unless you have to go to work, you're only allowed out of your home 1 time a day, and you're only allowed to see 1 person from another household per day. And your travel can only be within your local municipality, basically making travel within the country non-existent, because you can only go within your county type area. Most importantly, we had to cancel a lot of events, and the Ryder Cup, the greatest golf tournament played, was postponed to 2021. And if you are wondering, no, I can't tell you whether or not the tournament will actually happen, but what I can tell you is we are actively planning. We just finished doing all of the volunteer schedules, so optimism is high, but that's not my decision to make, and I don't have any inside information. So any questions about whether or not the Ryder Cup will happen, I won't be able to answer. Looking a little bit up in Green Bay, these are some of the statistics I shared with you earlier: occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR. For the month of December, shows the impact of not having fans at a football game. Our occupancy was down 57% to 27%, while our competitors was down a little bit less, about 35% to 32%. However, our ADR, one thing we do as a company when there are economic slowdowns in the hospitality industry is we do not sacrifice rate. We still believe we're delivering the same quality of product and the same luxury level of service. So our rate only went down about 20%, where our competitors went down about 30%. And then you can see on the far right the impact that had on revenue per available room. And the reason we believe holding on to rate is so important is it can take months to years for a lodging property to recover, depending on how drastically they cut rate. So our strategy is always hold rate, because we still deliver the same quality we did, regardless of what's going on in the economy. To give you a deeper look into our group segment, this is corporate groups who plan events. It was down 67% in 2020 versus 2019, but that's a bit deceiving, because we had the fortunate luck to have Citadel book a 6-week program at the American Club, where they basically turned the hotel into a bubble, like the NBA's did when they played their games. It was 100% buyout for 6 weeks in the American Club. And if I back out Citadel, because that was really a product of the pandemic, our group business was down 85%. So only 15% of the business we had on the books actually came to fruition in 2020 in the group market, which the significant majority of that being in January and February, before the pandemic really took hold here in the United States. So what's happening? Why are people traveling? Why did people leave their houses to take a trip in 2020? Globally, the most common reason was rejuvenation. We've all seen a lot of the data on mental wellness, COVID fatigue, and the fact that people want to have that human contact. Well, that has taken a toll on us. And as you can see with the green bar across the board here, rejuvenation was the #1 reason people cited as taking a trip and leaving their homes to relax and rejuvenate. But who's traveling? I don't think you'll be too surprised at this slide either. It is the younger generations who were taking the majority of the trips. The more mature, high-risk population traveled less than the younger generation. So those were the people who were making more trips and up versus the others. Now I'm going to switch a little bit and talk to you about food and beverage. Few staggering statistics that the food and beverage industry between March and October, just March and October of 2020, lost $130 billion in sales compared to the same time period the previous year. This resulted in 2.1 million lost jobs, which ties very closely to Marc's slide on the jobs which we've seen a decrease being the lower income jobs. And finally, about 110,000 restaurants were either permanently or long-term closed. And maybe for you, even one of your personal favorite restaurants might be currently closed or permanently closed. So what do we do as an organization? One of Kohler's philosophies is to use economic turndowns as a time to make ourselves stronger for when the economy returns. So we did a little bit of reconcepting and a little bit of expansion. So starting with reconcepting, our lowest performing restaurant, Kachina, here in Kohler, Wisconsin, had really done its time. So we took the opportunity to close it down and open a new restaurant, Tavern on Wood Lake. For those of you up in Green Bay, you might be familiar with our restaurant in Lodge Kohler, Tavern in the Sky. So we're creating our own personal brand now of Tavern, opening our second tavern here down in Kohler. And that launch has been incredibly successful. Traveling back over to St. Andrews, Scotland, these are renderings because it's actually in construction as I'm speaking right now. We are adding a fourth floor restaurant and bar, named to be determined, that will overlook the town, the Old Course Golf Course, and West Sands Beach. And a fun fact about that beach, if any of you have seen the Chariots of Fire movie, that's the actual beat where the iconic slow motion running scene was filmed. So tremendous, gorgeous views that our guests at the Old Course Hotel will be able to enjoy starting in July of this year. One area, vacation rental by owner, or known as VRBO, did see an increase in 2020. And I found some research as high as 25% increase in demand for cabins and houses. And according to the CDC, they of course are recommending to stay home, but if you are going to travel, they recommend that the safest place to go is a house or a cabin. At Kohler, we do have luxury cabins. We started with 2, Sand Hill and Red Fox, and in 2020, we opened 2 new ones, Lake and Pond. And when you look at the performance of Sand Hill and Red Fox, in 2020, it grew 27.6%, so slightly over that 25% number I just cited. But when I add on the additional revenue generated by Lake and Pond, which opened mid-year, it was actually an increase of 61%. So clearly our results here show how desirable those remote isolated cabins and homes have been for people who do want to travel. And on the upper left, that's Red Fox. The bottom left is Sand Hill. Upper right is our new cabin Pond, and bottom right is our new cabin Lake, which is on the bluffs of Lake Michigan with an amazing view, just to show you what our luxury cabin market looks like. So let's talk a little bit about 2021. Optimism is returning to travel. 1 in 10 travelers feel optimistic about taking a trip in the next 12 months. The other half needs a little bit of reassurance, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the future slides. As an industry, we are on track to recover in 2023. So if you look at the bottom 3 lines, it shows you 2020 versus 21 and 22, and you can see the growth in occupancy of 16.6% this year and 24% next year. ADR, again, earlier I said it's very hard to get your rate back. So you can see a much more modest approach in growth in ADR of 4% in 21 and then 8% in 22. And then that effect on what I called earlier as revenue per available room, the mathematical calculation of both of those numbers. How are people traveling? Well, people have been traveling primarily by personal vehicles, traveling as far as 6 hours to take a trip to rejuvenate or a vacation. However, in 21, and this ties into a little bit about what Marc said earlier, the other modes of transportation, air, train, and bus, are going to start to grow, and more people are going to feel a little bit safer to get on a plane, train, or a bus, thereby extending how far they will travel to take a vacation. But what is most important when people travel? The most important aspect is flexibility. People want to know when they travel that should something happen and they're unable to take the trip, their deposit will be refunded. And this is yet another way that we've had to reinvent ourselves. Not only is the booking window shrunk to 3 weeks, but we've had to become far more gracious and understanding and forgiving with our cancellation policies, where pre-pandemic, we would not have refunded a deposit unless there was truly an emergency. But in today's world, in 2020 and 21, forgiving of those cancellation policies has become very, very important when travelers are making a decision. In addition, 8 in 10 travelers are looking for safety, cleanliness, reduced capacity, and as much contactless interaction with the staff as possible. And of the leading factors for travelers, if you would have asked me a year ago, is this going to be the case? Use of masks is enforced is the #1 thing travelers are looking for when they're selecting a destination. Number 2 is that they can actually afford the trip. And then if you look at 3, 4, and 5, all of these are also brand new characteristics travelers are seeking in light of what's changed in the pandemic. So as I said earlier, we've had to reinvent ourselves quite a bit, and 4 of the 5 things travelers are looking for really relate to changes stemmed from the pandemic. So what about the vaccine? Will that have a positive impact? And according to this data, yes, about 70% of travelers said that a vaccine will have an impact on their travel plans, while 30% said no. So more optimism will come to the market as vaccines are further deployed. So I've been talking a little bit about innovation and reinvention. Sorry about that. Some things that we're working on right now the first thing is keyless entry. We're putting keyless entry in all of our hotels to reduce that contact, having to give that guest key card, which is a high touch item. Nobody wants to touch the cards anymore, or fobs. They want to use their phones, which they trust a little bit more greatly than they do with something handed to them by a front desk agent. From there, we're going to implement contactless check-in and check-out. So you don't even need to go to the front desk. Before you arrive, you can check into your room, get your key, and go right to your room without having to stop at the front desk. And finally, there are technologies out there like robot front desk agents, delivery robots. And while that's a little bit more on the science fiction side, that is certainly something we're taking a look at to see if we could look at additional ways to provide contactless service. In addition, we've actually created a contactless spa service, which uses vibration tuning bowls. And while it's not a massage, it is a great relaxation rejuvenation service, as well as, of course, all restaurants have done curbside delivery so that we can deliver your food to you. Another trend that's occurred is the micro wedding. What is a micro wedding? It's a wedding of about 50 guests or less. So instead of these big 100, 200, 300 or more gala events, brides and grooms are making the decision to still go ahead with their weddings, but inviting 50 or less of their closest personal friends and family. And how is that translated here at Destination Kohler? Well, we are seeing something very unique. The brides and grooms that are having weddings are still having the same budget. So whether it's 50 people or 300 people, they're still spending the same amount of dollars. They're just upgrading anything and everything possible. Better linen, tables, furniture, food, gifts for their guests. It's really been quite remarkable. So the weddings have been quite lavish, lovely, and it's the new dream that the brides are dreaming for their fairy tale storybook weddings. The next trend is virtual wellness. On-demand wellness has also been a growing trend during the pandemic. And according to some statistics, people who subscribe to on-demand wellness are more stickier in the year. So those who join in January, if they join a on-demand wellness virtual, about 50% will still be participating by the end of the year, where those who go to traditional gyms, only about 25% who join in January actually have their memberships at the end of the year. And the growth in online virtual wellness is going to be explosive. It's going to grow from $6 billion in 2019 to $59 billion in 2027. And at this moment, here at Destination Kohler, we are under development for our own virtual wellness platform, which will be launching sometime in, I don't know why my thing keeps bouncing. I'm so sorry about that. Our last reinvention has been virtual events. We have created a series of events for groups, families, get-togethers, Maybe you're having a corporate group, you do some training, you share some company statistics, and at the end you switch to a virtual event. And we have a series of them, from wellness to wreath making, chili, cookie decorating, where these kits are delivered to the participant prior to the event. And when the corporation is done with their business, they're a chef, a yoga instructor, our floral manager will come on and then lead the audience through the demonstration. And by the end, you've actually created or used whatever in the box. And I want to finish today with two thoughts. 2020 has been the best leadership class we've ever taken. These are my words. When you think about going to a leadership class, you learn a lot of great things, and then you leave and you go and you put them to use. Well, in 2020, we were under constant change as the rules changed, the guidelines, closing, opening, and the leadership we had to exert, the tough decisions we had to make, truly was the best real-time leadership class we've ever experienced. And it's really about the 3 R's, not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but reopen, reinvention, and recovery. So we had to reopen in a safe manner that made our guests feel like they could come here and be safe. And I'm proud to share that at this point, we have 0 known cases of spread of the virus from associate to associate or guest to associate, either way, within the workplace since we reopened. Reinvention, I've talked to you about many things that we've had to do to reinvent ourselves, and we are still on a journey to reinvent hospitality. And finally, by 2023, we'll have recovery. So those are the 3 R's as I see it in hospitality. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass it over to Marc.
Christine, thank you very much for that excellent presentation, giving us an update of what's happening in the hospitality sector. I know I learned a lot from it actually myself. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you all of our participants, Peyton, Emily, myself. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I know it obviously is a lot of information we shared with you this morning. I think if I was going to give the quick, I know we're about 2 minutes over time, I was going to give the quick 1 minute recap of everything, which is kind of impossible, but I'll do my best. I think I would say a lot of our GDP numbers, while we've experienced a lot of volatility, are starting to normalize a little bit to what they have been historically in the past. I think we're seeing the labor market still has a long way to go, even though it's recovered. And while we've seen some industries thriving, such as the housing market and the stock market, we also see other specific industries, such as grocery retail, being recovered versus other industries, as Christine had alluded to, in hospitality, recreation, entertainment, are still lagging behind. The optimistic thing moving forward, I think, is that we seem to be on a positive trend here with the vaccine, and hopefully we can get out from underneath some of the pandemic stuff so we can start to return to normal. But I do think it's worth noting, while there's been a large policy response, some of that response is tied to the fact that there really is a fractured environment, depending on what your circumstances were prior to COVID. So it's something to keep in mind as we start to move forward and get past this recovery. I'd like to take one more second and thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure having you. We enjoy doing these events. You will be receiving a post-event survey to get some feedback so we can actually incorporate some ideas moving forward. I would also encourage you as well. We did an event partnering with the New North and the Wisconsin Department of Revenue back in December. That's more of our state and regional outlook. We'll be doing another one of those coming up in the next couple of months here. So please keep your eyes open for that event. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And have a good rest of your morning, not listening to an economist talk anymore.